Today's video we're going to cover tips and tricks of restoring and rebuilding Muncie transmissions. Many 60s muscle cars and 70s Camaros and things like that have Muncie transmissions as their gearbox. They're relatively straightforward. There's lots of great information out there as far as books out there to put them together, and there's some really good resources. One resource is Paul Cangliosi. He's like 5speeds.com. He has a really nice rebuild kit and components and everything, and they're the best quality out there out of everything that I've seen. Highly recommended. But before you get started for the first time, the first thing you might want to do is go to your local box store and go buy some pieces of pipe. A lot of times they have scrap pieces of pipe that they'll cut for you and this and that. This one here is 1.25 inch pipe, and it's 6 1/4 inches long. And what this is used for is the speedometer gear needs to be pressed on to the main shaft, and what I do is the 6 1/4 inch length is designed that once you press it on, it'll act as a stop on the end of the main shaft, and it'll actually locate the speedometer gear into position where you need to have it. Now the 6.25 inches is based on a speedometer cable on the driver's side right of the car. If it's something else, sometimes they're in the center and sometimes they're forward. You would need to change the length of this accordingly. But it's really simple, and that way you're locating on the surface when you press this on, and it works really well. Another piece of pipe that you get is 1.5 inch pipe that's 16 inches long. And what this will be used for is when you want to start pressing everything out of the main shaft, you can use that. It's long enough. Or if you want to press the bearings in to the front of the case, or press things out, it's a good size. And the 1.5 inch pipe gives you adequate clearance and allows you to do all of these things. So again, that's a really nice piece to have. Next is, a lot of times when you're putting the countershaft into the case and the reverse idler, there's a bunch of these little thrust washers that you need to put inside the case. And some people say to use grease, but when you start turning it upside down or whatever, they have a tendency to fall out. So what I use is this Anaerobic gasket maker, and I just put a little bit on the back sides of these, and I put pressure against them and actually kind of bond them into the case. So that way they're kind of fixtured into position, and what you can use is use the main shaft to just make sure that it's centered in the hole or whatever, so it's not drooping down too much, so when you put your shafts in, you're okay. And then on the reverse idler gear, what you can actually do is put this stub shaft back in, and this step will go against the thrust washer, and that'll give you some really nice pressure to while it fixtures. So that way, when you end up putting the counter shaft in or whatever, you don't have to worry about those falling out of position. Back to the counter shaft. There's a lot of recommendations to use transmission lube when you're putting in all of the roller bearings, and then and they're fixtured adequately enough with the transmission grease to put the counter shaft into the transmission housing. I don't have good luck with doing that. Maybe I'm just not skilled enough or whatever, but what I end up doing is, when I'm putting the counter shaft together, there's a spacer tube that's in the center, and one of the big things of the spacer tube is it doesn't fit tight inside of the gear, so it can actually hang down. And so when you go to put a shaft in order to something, it can actually have the tendency to hang in that edge and cock, and then you end up pushing your bearings all out. So what I end up doing is I put the spacer tube inside of the countershaft, and then I reach around the back with my finger, and you could, you know, use a socket if your fingers aren't long enough or whatever, and kind of hold that into position. And then I put in the 2 rows of the roller bearings, you know, using the transmission lube. And once I get those in, I'll put the shaft that it mounts onto into those first 2 rows of bearings, and start it into the spacer tube. Now, keep in mind on these shafts, I've highlighted here in black. This is a higher diameter that's a press fit into your mid plate. So you want to make sure that you're not trying to put that in when you're doing this. But you just do this, and what I'll do is, you know, those first 2, you know, you'll put this through, you put this halfway through the spacer tube. Then what you can do is, what's hanging out is you can kind of use this as a handle, and then on the opposite side put in the 2 rows of your bearings. And then what you can do is, you know, you can push it all the way through, and then you can kind of back off halfway and make sure that they're packed, you know, go through the other way and make sure that they're packed on that side. And that seems to work really well. And then what I do is I make, some people call them dummy shafts. I just call it a keeper shaft. That once that's all done, I've got this shaft that's not the same diameter as this, but is a little bit undersized. These run about 0.993 thousandths of an inch. And what I do is I'll make one that's like 0.989 to 0.991. So it's it's a couple of thousandths undersized, and this is 8.3 inches long. And what I'll do is, when that counter shaft is all put together, I'll put this in and push this one out. So this will be inside the counter shaft at that point, you know, holding those all in. Because, you know, when I start tipping the whole counter shaft in, the bearings always fall out, even if they're glued really well. I don't know if it's because it's super humid here where I live or whatever, but then that way they're restrained, and I know that they're not going to fall out. And then what I'll do is I'll put the counter shaft in, you know, in between our 2 thrust washers that we use Anaerobic to glue into the case, and put this in. And then once it's lined up, I'll just push this through to the front a little bit just to start engagement. And then at that point, I can push the main shaft through. And as this is coming through, this will come out until you get to this point where you need to press it into the mid plate or whatever. So not into the case, I mean, not the mid plate. And that works, you know, that works really well that way. All this is doing is just stopping the things from falling out. You know, you're loading them the normal way, and you're pushing this through all the way as you're working it. Then that way you make sure that the spacer tube and everything's in alignment, and then you're just putting this in as an intermediate step, and then you're putting the shaft back in. It sounds a little confusing, but it works well. You know, I've spent hours sometimes trying to put the Countergear in, and once I use this approach, it's in like 10 minutes, and you know, I'm not that experienced, so that's pretty awesome. One other thing, when you're putting the oil slinger onto the input shaft, you know, your input shaft is usually facing up when you put it on before the bearing. The little raised portion faces upwards before you put the bearing on. That's just a good, you know, keep in mind. And another thing too is, when you're tearing your transmission apart, this idler gear has a couple of bushings inside of it. You know, make sure that you don't press these bushings out, because they're not available in the rebuild kits or whatever. I guess that these are pressed in and then they're custom honed at the factory for the shaft. So you want to make sure that you don't pull those out, because you're not going to have replacements. And then another thing that's always, you know, a concern is the detent onto the transmission housing. What I did is, again, went to my local box store and they had this little pry tool or whatever. And what I did is it was like a putty knife, scraper, and a little right angle here. And I cut it in half. I cut this out. So I ended up with just a 1/2 inch wide right angle. You know, some people suggest taking putty knives and bending them and stuff like that. I happen to be able to find this. And what you'll end up doing is it works really well because this land on the case, you can just kind of get in back behind and push down onto the ball to put the reverse shaft in up over that detent ball. It works really well, and you know, if you can't find that, you could definitely replicate something like it. So that's that. And then another thing is input shaft bearings. You know, you know, you're supposed to, again, grease these to hold them in the position, and they always seem to fall out no matter what. So what I do is, this is a roll for, you know, paper towels, and what it does is the inside diameter of the paper towel roll matches the outside diameter of the cage that these bearings go in. And what I do is I put these all on, use grease, and then you push it down, and what it's doing is it's just giving enough force to hold these roller bearings inside of the cage without them popping out. There's enough friction there. And now what you've got is a really nice handle too, so you can actually reach down in through here to install this bearing under the input shaft. So it actually serves two purposes. So you can put your input shaft in and just reach down in with this and install your bearing. Real simple, but it works really well. As you can see, I'm kind of going all over the place and the bearings are being contained. And then another thing, cleaning the case. You know, a lot of people like the glass bead cases or paint them or stuff like that, but if you're doing a restoration, that's really not that desirable. But what I found is, like, this die cast is usually hard to get a nice texture or a nice finish on, and you still want to maintain the die cast. As you can see, this looks really nice along with this case. What I use is simple green and green Scotch-Brite pads, okay? I'm pretty sure that these are just Scotch-Brite pads. I don't think they have any abrasive in them. I think you can buy Scotch-Brites that have abrasive and stuff on them too. But this is just like a regular pad, almost like what you buy for scouring pots and pans at home, but this is a little bit finer. And what I do is I use this and simple green. I have simple green in a spray bottle. Spray it really well. It helps break up the grease, and you just keep rubbing lightly all over the place to get rid of your oxidation and your grease, and to get into nooks and crannies like inside of here. What I use is I use these plastic pry bar tools as backing for the Scotch-Brite. And as you can see, these tools, you can get inside these nooks and crannies really good with some pressure. You know, you could use some popsicle sticks and other things too. You know, these you probably have in your toolbox already, but you know, I kind of like these that have the hook so you can go on sides of ribs or whatever. And this one seems to work really well also. It's a small point. So that's pretty much it. You know, hopefully these will help you out. It's just some ideas that I've come across when I'm putting these things together, and they've really helped me out. You know, relatively, you know, you can pick up these pieces of pipe for about $5 or $6. You could pick one of these up for like $3 or $4 and modify it. You know, simple green and Scotch-Brite pads are relatively inexpensive. You know, this stuff, this Dynatech Anaerobic gasket maker, this should be like the 8th wonder of the world. This stuff is awesome. You know, I get turned on to this from Paul on his website or whatever, and I bought it from him. And this stuff is amazing. I really like this for seating gaskets and, you know, sealing up bearings, you know, and things like that. It works really well, and it's definitely something that everybody should have in your toolbox. So thanks for watching, and hopefully these will help you out when you put your transmission together.